Long before written history began, the world may have already ended once. Not through legend or imagination, but through gradual changes that erased coastlines, buried cities, and fractured human memory. What we call the beginning of civilization may instead be a continuation built atop fragments of an earlier world that did not survive intact. Across the globe, the evidence appears quietly. Stone structures without clear origins. Knowledge systems that emerge fully formed. Maps that depict lands no longer visible. Myths that remember loss without preserving detail. These are not anomalies taken in isolation. Together, they suggest interruption rather than invention. In this documentary, we explore the idea that advanced societies existed before recorded history and vanished without leaving complete traces behind. This is not a story of fantasy or sudden catastrophe, but of disappearance through time, water, and forgetting. What remains is not proof, but pattern, and a question that refuses to disappear. The age that left no ruins. Long before stone cities rose beside rivers, human history described a different world. It was not recorded through dates or diagrams. It survived through fragments that resisted classification. These fragments appear in stories that begin calmly and end abruptly. They describe order, knowledge, and structure, followed by sudden removal. The absence that follows is more important than the events themselves. One of the earliest records comes from Mesopotamia. The Sumerian king list opens with rulers whose reigns extend beyond normal human limits. Alulim of Eridu is assigned 28,800 years. Alanga follows with 36,000. The text offers no justification. Longevity is presented as fact, not metaphor. After several such rulers, a single line divides the record. Then the flood swept over. After that moment, kings reign for decades instead of millennia. The document does not explain the transition, it simply continues. A similar structure appears in ancient Egyptian tradition. The Turin royal canon begins with divine rulers, followed by semi-divine beings, and then by mortal kings. Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE, separated Egyptian history into ages ruled by gods, spirits, and humans. Later scholars interpreted these divisions symbolically, yet the pattern mirrors Mesopotamian records with striking precision. In early Indian tradition, cycles of creation and destruction dominate historical memory. The Matsya Purana describes a great flood that resets human order. Kings before the deluge rule in an age of completeness. Afterward, society resumes with reduced scope and altered knowledge. The narrative is not dramatic, it is administrative. Names are listed, durations are measured, loss is implied rather than explained. Mesoamerican sources show the same quiet reset. The Popol Vuh describes earlier worlds formed, populated, and then undone. One world ends by flood, another collapses through imbalance. Each ending removes nearly everything. Survivors appear with limited capacity. Culture restarts rather than continues. These traditions developed independently. They are separated by oceans and languages, yet they share a common structure. An early age is described as whole. A single disruptive event follows. What comes next is smaller, simpler, and incomplete. Geology supports the possibility of such disruption. At the end of the last ice age, global temperatures shifted rapidly. Sea levels rose more than 100 meters between 14,000 and 8,000 BCE. Vast coastal plains vanished. These regions were ideal for early settlement due to access to water, food, and transport. Their disappearance would erase cities without trace. The Younger Dryas event intensified this instability. Ice core samples from Greenland show sudden cooling within decades. Rainfall patterns changed. Glacial melt accelerated, then slowed, then resumed. Agriculture would fail under such conditions. trade routes would collapse, population centers would fracture. Archaeology reveals a sharp boundary during this period. Complex stone tools and symbolic artifacts appear earlier, then disappear. In some regions, hunting and gathering resumes after long periods of apparent advancement. Progress does not follow a straight line. It breaks. Coastal archaeology remains limited. Rising seas covered early settlements beneath sediment and water. Only inland or elevated sites remain accessible. This creates an illusion of sudden beginnings. Civilizations appear to emerge fully formed because earlier phases are no longer visible. This absence becomes significant when examining later monumental cultures. In Egypt, advanced architecture appears with little developmental history. The Great Pyramid at Giza emerges during the 4th dynasty with no clear prototypes. Earlier mastabas exist, but their scale and precision differ sharply. There is no gradual refinement toward pyramid construction. Egyptian inscriptions focus on ritual and symbolism. They describe kingship, afterlife, and divine order. They do not describe engineering processes. Measurements are sacred. Techniques are not recorded. Later, dynasties repair and imitate earlier monuments without explaining their origin. Erosion patterns on the Great Sphinx suggest prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. Such rainfall has not occurred in Egypt since the late Ice Age. This implies either misdating or reuse of an older structure. If the monument predates dynastic Egypt, then Egypt did not originate it. It inherited it. Inheritance explains continuity without authorship. A culture can preserve, maintain, and repurpose structures without knowing how they were built. Over generations, meaning replaces method. Sacred narratives overwrite practical memory. This pattern appears elsewhere. In South America, later civilizations settled among stone ruins they did not create. Inca records state that certain structures existed before their ancestors arrived. These stones were repaired and revered, not replicated. Loss of knowledge does not require extinction. It requires disruption. Skilled workers perish. Specialists disappear. Written records decay. Oral traditions compress. What remains are objects without manuals. The idea of pre-flood ghost civilizations emerges from these gaps. These societies do not leave continuous records because continuity itself was broken. Their cities lie underwater, their tools corroded, their systems dissolved. Only durable materials remain, stripped of explanation. What survives is not chaos, but silence. The earliest age is not described as primitive, it is described as complete. After the flood, humanity continues with less reach and fewer capacities. Time resets without starting from nothing. Egyptian civilization may represent one such continuation. Its monuments do not mark an origin point, but a resumption. The Nile floods annually, reinforcing memory of loss and renewal. Kings align themselves with eternal stone rather than innovation. Pre-flood civilizations do not need advanced machines to explain their disappearance. Climate alone is sufficient. Water erases more thoroughly than fire. When coastlines vanish, so do histories. What matters is convergence. Independent traditions describe the same sequence. Science allows for the same disruption. Archaeology reveals the same absence. Together, they form a quiet outline of something removed. The age before the flood does not end with collapse. It ends with omission. Its builders do not leave names. Its maps dissolve. Its tools scatter. Later, cultures inherit the ground and the stones, but not the instructions. The past resumes without explanation. Structures stand without context. Memory reshapes loss into myth. The world continues, carrying gaps it no longer recognizes, stone older than memory. Across several regions of the world, massive stone structures exist without a clear place in recorded development. These stones are not isolated curiosities. They appear as foundations, retaining walls, platforms, and chambers. Their scale exceeds practical necessity for the societies later associated with them. Their precision exceeds what is required for symbolism alone. Most importantly, they appear early, then are never repeated with the same consistency. In the highlands of Peru, carefully fitted stone blocks form walls that remain stable after centuries of earthquakes. Each block is shaped to meet surrounding stones along irregular edges that interlock from multiple directions. The surfaces meet tightly, yet the faces are not uniform. This design distributes stress rather than resisting it. Seismic energy passes through the wall instead of breaking it. Such an approach suggests deliberate engineering rather than aesthetic choice. The culture historically linked to these sites maintained them but did not replicate them. Later constructions nearby rely on smaller stones, straight joints, and mortar. These later additions are effective but different. There is no transitional phase connecting the two methods. The most complex work appears first. In Egypt, large stone elements appeared deep within monuments where visibility was never intended. Granite blocks weighing many tons were transported long distances and placed with minimal tolerance inside sealed chambers. Their surfaces are flat beyond what casual workmanship requires. These stones were not carved to impress an observer. Their placement suggests functional importance, though the function itself is unknown. Granite must be cut through abrasion or repeated impact. Copper tools dull quickly against it. Experimental replication requires prolonged labor under controlled conditions. Yet in the archaeological record, the granite work appears fully developed from its first use, then declines in later periods. The stone remains, the method does not. Elsewhere, along the eastern Mediterranean, massive stone foundations sit beneath later temples and public buildings. These stones are larger than those used above them. They were placed first, then reused. The cultures that inherited them did not remove or reshape them. They built upon them instead. This indicates respect, but also limitation. The foundation stones are often aligned with precision, suggesting careful planning at the earliest stage. Later structures follow different measurement systems and orientations. The base does not match the superstructure. Two different traditions occupy the same site without merging. On islands separated by vast distances, similar construction patterns appear. Large stone platforms with tight-fitting joints support statues or structures of lesser precision. The platforms remain consistent. The elements placed upon them vary widely in quality. This suggests that the platforms were already present when later works were added. Stoneworking usually improves gradually. Early efforts are rough, tools evolve, techniques spread. In these cases, the sequence reverses. The earliest visible work is the most demanding. Later work simplifies. Such reversal implies interruption. Skills did not evolve backward by choice. They were lost. Loss requires disruptions severe enough to erase training systems and long-term planning. Environmental change provides such disruption without requiring conflict or invasion. At the end of the last ice age, climatic instability reshaped coastlines and weather patterns. Sea levels rose rapidly. Low-lying settlements disappeared. Rivers changed course. Regions that supported dense populations became uninhabitable. Knowledge systems dependent on continuity fractured under these conditions. Stone survives these events unevenly. Coastal stonework sinks. Inland stonework remains exposed. Organic materials vanish. Metals corrode. Only the most durable elements persist, separated from the systems that created them. Later populations encounter these stones without context. They reuse them. They repair damage. They incorporate them into new cultural frameworks. Over time, attribution shifts from builders to gods or ancestors. Explanation becomes reverence. In written traditions, references to earlier builders often lack detail. They are described as first people, elder races, or beings closer to the divine. These descriptions acknowledge distance without preserving information. The builders are remembered as different, not as teachers. The absence of detailed construction records is consistent across sites. Where writing survives, it focuses on ritual, ownership, or restoration. Instructions for shaping or moving large stone blocks are not preserved. This absence suggests that by the time writing systems stabilized, the knowledge was already gone. Stone blocks placed with high precision require coordination. Quarrying, transport, shaping, and placement must follow shared standards. This implies organized labor and long-term planning. Such organization is vulnerable to sudden environmental stress. When planning horizons collapse, societies shift toward survival rather than expansion. Projects spanning decades become impossible. Maintenance replaces innovation. Precision gives way to adequacy. Archaeological layers reflect this shift. After periods of disruption, toolkits simplify. Artistic complexity declines. Settlement patterns contract. These are not signs of ignorance. They are signs of adaptation under constraint. The stonework that remains does not demand extraordinary technology. It demands time, stability, and shared practice. These conditions may have existed briefly, then vanished. If advanced societies existed before major climatic disruption, their most enduring traces would be stone placed above later flood levels. These traces appear anomalous only because their context is missing. Stone does not carry memory, it carries form. Later observers infer purpose from shape, not from instruction. When forms exceed expectations, explanations drift towards speculation or dismissal. What remains consistent is pattern, early precision, later simplification, inheritance without continuity. Stones that are maintained but not repeated. No identity is assigned to the builders. No single origin is required. Material evidence appears across regions shaped by similar environmental stress. The stones stand where they were placed. Their builders do not leave names. Their methods do not persist. Their work remains integrated into later civilizations that move forward without knowing how it began. The gap between result and explanation defines the problem. Stone occupies that gap quietly. Maps without a world. Long before satellites, aerial surveys, or global navigation, human cultures produced maps that extended beyond their immediate surroundings. These maps did not simply mark villages, rivers, or borders. Some depicted entire coastlines. Others suggested landforms no longer visible. In several cases, the geography shown does not align with the world as it existed when the maps were copied. Instead, the features correspond to conditions that would have existed much earlier. One of the most discussed examples surfaced in 1929, when a fragmentary map was rediscovered in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, the chart shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coastline of South America, and an extension of land further south. The map includes notes stating that it was compiled from much older sources, including charts from the time of Alexander, and others taken from captured Spanish and Portuguese ships. What draws attention is not the inclusion of the Americas, which were known by then, but the accuracy of the coastlines. The curvature of South America aligns closely with modern measurements. More unusual is the southern landmass. Some researchers argue it represents Antarctica without ice, connected to South America. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. Its ice-free coastline would not have been visible for thousands of years. The Piri Reis map is not unique. In 1531, Orens Phineas published a world map depicting a southern continent with rivers, mountain ranges, and inland lakes. The landmass occupies the position of Antarctica and is shown as temperate rather than frozen. The coastlines differ from the modern ice boundary and instead resemble the bedrock contours beneath the ice sheet, mapped only in the 20th century using radar. Another example appears in the work of Gerardus Mercator. His 1569 world map includes a large southern continent labeled Terra Australis. While speculative landmasses were common at the time, Mercator's depiction includes internal details not typically assigned to hypothetical regions. Some features correspond loosely to Antarctic geography beneath the ice. Critics argue that these maps are imaginative or coincidental. Early cartographers often filled unknown spaces with guesswork. Yet this explanation weakens when examined alongside the source notes left by the mapmakers themselves. Many explicitly stated that they were copying older charts rather than inventing new ones. In the case of Piri Reis, annotations explain that some source maps dated back thousands of years. The claim itself does not prove accuracy, but it does indicate that older geographic knowledge was believed to exist and to be valuable. The map was not presented as an innovation, it was presented as an inheritance. Other maps show similar anomalies. The Zeno map, published in 1558, depicts islands in the North Atlantic that do not exist today. Some of these landforms resemble submerged features on the ocean floor, identified centuries later. While the map contains errors, it also contains details difficult to attribute to chance alone. Chinese cartographic tradition adds another layer. Ancient Chinese maps often depicted coastlines extending far beyond known trade routes. A map known as the Cangnedo, created in 1402, shows Africa with surprising accuracy for its time, including a southern tip extending eastward. This predates Portuguese exploration of that region. The Cangnedo map was itself a copy of earlier materials, some attributed to Islamic and possibly older sources. The recurring theme is transmission. Maps were not always drawn from direct observation. They were copied, revised, and preserved across generations. Each copying introduced distortions, but also retained core structures. When environments changed, the maps remained static, preserving older realities. Sea level rise provides context. During the last ice age, global sea levels were significantly lower. Large areas of continental shelf were exposed. Coastlines extended outward by hundreds of kilometers in some regions. Rivers followed different paths. Islands existed where shallow seas now lie. If early civilizations occupied these coastal zones, their navigators would map shorelines that no longer exist. When sea levels rose, those coastlines disappeared. The maps, however, survived inland. This would explain why some ancient maps show landforms that do not correspond to modern geography, but align with submerged features. It would also explain why later cultures struggled to reconcile these maps with their lived environment. Navigation requires practical accuracy. Sailors rely on recognizable features, distances, and angles. Charts that were consistently wrong would not be preserved. The survival of certain map traditions suggests that they were once useful. Latitude measurements could be achieved with simple instruments. Longitude was more difficult, requiring timekeeping. Yet some ancient maps show proportional relationships consistent across large distances. This implies either repeated correction over time or access to advanced observational methods. The question then shifts from capability to continuity. If early cartographic knowledge existed, why did it not persist openly? Environmental disruption offers an answer. When coastlines vanish and trade networks collapse, navigation loses relevance. Maps become relics rather than tools. As societies rebuild inland, priorities change. Agricultural cycles replace maritime exploration. Oral traditions compress. Written materials decay or are repurposed. Maps survive only where copying traditions endure, often disconnected from original context. This disconnect is visible in later interpretations. Medieval scholars struggled to reconcile ancient maps with biblical cosmology. Southern continents were reimagined as theoretical balances to northern landmasses. Accuracy became abstraction. Yet beneath abstraction, shapes persisted. Coastlines retained their curves. Distances remained proportionate. Errors accumulated at the edges, but the core structure endured. Antarctica remains central to the discussion because of its isolation. The continent is covered by ice, averaging more than a kilometre thick. Beneath that ice lies a complex coastline with bays, peninsulas, and mountain ranges. Radar surveys conducted in the 20th century revealed these features. Some match elements shown on early maps more closely than the modern ice outline does. This does not require global exploration in the modern sense. It requires observation during a period when the ice was absent or reduced. Geological evidence suggests that parts of Antarctica were ice-free as recently as 12,000 years ago. Coastal regions would have been accessible. If humans reached those regions during that time, they would have encountered a very different world. Temperate conditions would allow navigation, mapping, and settlement. When the ice returned, access would end abruptly. The maps would then represent a world that no longer existed. Later copyists, unaware of the original context, would preserve the outlines while reinterpreting their meaning. Maps also function as memory storage. They encode spatial relationships that survive beyond spoken language. When stories fade, diagrams remain. Over time, symbols lose explanation but retain form. The absence of explicit claims about Antarctica in ancient texts does not negate the possibility of early knowledge. Silence is expected when continuity breaks. Lost places become unnamed. Known lands become mythic. Some traditions describe southern lands of abundance or balance. Others speak of distant regions beyond the known world. These references are vague, yet persistent. Cartography bridges vagueness and precision. It preserves shape without narrative. When compared across cultures, similar shapes appear independently. This convergence does not prove a single source civilization. It suggests shared inheritance through fragmented transmission. Knowledge does not vanish uniformly. It fractures. What remains visible are edges, coastlines that no longer meet the sea, islands that sank, continents that froze, maps without a matching world. Later, explorers encountered these discrepancies firsthand. As navigation expanded during the Age of Discovery, ancient maps both guided and misled. Some coastlines appeared where land once existed. Others failed to appear at all. The failure did not invalidate the maps. It revealed temporal mismatch. The maps described an older Earth. Geography is not fixed. Ice advances. Seas rise. Rivers shift. Maps freeze moments in time. When preserved beyond their era, they become anachronisms. The survival of such maps implies that they were valued beyond immediate utility. They were copied because they represented authority. Ancient knowledge carried weight even when misunderstood. This respect suggests recognition of prior achievement. Later, cultures did not dismiss earlier maps as errors. They attempted to reconcile them, indicating belief in their origin. If pre-flood civilizations possessed advanced navigation and mapping skills, their loss would not erase all traces. Copies would circulate. Errors would accumulate. Original context would fade. What remains are outlines, proportions, coastlines that no longer exist, landforms hidden beneath ice. Maps become quiet witnesses to environmental change. They record worlds that ended not through collapse of skill, but through transformation of landscape. The earth remembered. The sea erased. Paper endured. The silence in the timelines. Historical records often present the past as a continuous sequence. Dates follow dates. Cultures replace one another through conquest or reform. Progress appears gradual. Yet when examined closely, the timelines of human civilization contain long intervals where continuity breaks down. These intervals are not marked by clear endings or transitions. They are marked by silence. In many regions, complex cultures appear, then vanish, leaving gaps that last centuries or longer. When activity resumes, the new societies do not clearly descend from what came before. Technologies simplify, settlement patterns change, artistic traditions restart with different rules. The absence is rarely explained by contemporary sources. One of the clearest examples appears in the archaeological record of the Near East. During the late Pleistocene, communities such as the Natufians practiced semi-sedentary living. They built stone structures, harvested wild grains, and buried their dead with ritual care. These practices suggest long-term planning and social organization. Then, during the Younger Dryas period, many of these settlements were abandoned. For nearly 1,000 years, signs of complexity diminish. Architecture becomes simpler. Population density drops. Only after this interval does agriculture reappear in a more structured form. The earlier phase does not smoothly evolve into the later one. It ends, pauses, and resumes differently. A similar pattern is visible in Egypt. Predynastic cultures show gradual development in pottery, burial customs, and settlement size. Then, around 3100 BCE, centralized rule appears abruptly. Writing, monumental architecture, and administrative systems emerge together. There is no clear record of how these systems were tested or refined. They appear as complete frameworks. The absence of transitional documentation is striking. Writing itself appears fully formed, with hundreds of hieroglyphs already standardized. Bureaucratic organization appears immediately complex. The gap between village culture and state civilization is not clearly bridged in the material record. In the Americas, comparable silences exist. At sites such as Poverty Point in North America, large earthworks appear around 1700 BCE, requiring coordinated labor and planning. After several centuries, the site is abandoned. Later cultures in the region do not continue the same construction methods. The knowledge required to build such structures does not transfer visibly. In Mesoamerica, early ceremonial centers emerge, then disappear. The Olmec heartland shows evidence of sudden fluorescence, followed by decline. Later civilizations reuse symbols and sites, but not systems. Writing appears, disappears, then reappears in altered form. Timelines fracture rather than flow. These interruptions are often attributed to migration, conflict, or environmental stress. While these explanations are plausible, they rarely account for the scale of loss observed. Cultural memory appears to reset beyond what gradual decline would suggest. Environmental change offers one explanation for such resets. Rapid climate shifts disrupt food production, trade, and settlement stability. When populations disperse, specialized knowledge becomes difficult to maintain. Skills dependent on apprenticeship and repetition fade quickly. Sea level rise plays a central role in this process. During the end of the Ice Age, coastlines moved inland dramatically. Many early settlements likely existed near water for transportation and resources. As these areas flooded, populations retreated. The archaeological record of these regions now lies underwater. This creates a distortion in historical reconstruction. Later, inland sites appear to be origins rather than refuges. Earlier coastal complexity disappears from view entirely. Timelines reconstructed from surviving sites omit what was lost. Written records amplify this distortion. Writing requires stable institutions. When institutions collapse, writing ceases. Oral tradition compresses memory into myth. Precise chronology dissolves. When writing resumes, it begins anew, often without reference to the previous system. This pattern is visible in mythic histories that describe earlier ages ending in catastrophe. Floods, fires, and darkness recur across cultures. These stories are often dismissed as symbolic, yet they align with periods of environmental upheaval identified through scientific data. The absence of detailed explanation within these myths is notable. They do not describe gradual decline. They describe removal. One age ends, another begins. The transition is not narrated. Archaeology encounters the same problem. Layers of occupation are separated by sterile strata. Tools change abruptly. Building techniques shift. The cause is not always evident in the soil. What remains is discontinuity. These silences challenge linear models of progress. They suggest that civilization does not always accumulate steadily. It can fragment, retract, and restart. Knowledge is not guaranteed to persist. The loss of continuity does not imply total collapse. It implies selective survival. Some skills endure, others vanish. The resulting culture is not primitive, but incomplete relative to what preceded it. This incompleteness shapes later interpretation. When societies encounter remnants of earlier complexity, they reinterpret them. Structures become sacred. Artifacts become heirlooms. Explanation yields to reverence. Timelines attempt to impose order on these fragments. Dates are assigned. Periods are named. Yet the gaps remain. They resist compression. They represent missing time rather than unknown detail. The silence in the timelines is not empty. It is filled with implication. Something occurred that reduced visibility without erasing all traces. Something disrupted continuity across multiple regions at similar times. Climate data indicates that such disruption occurred globally near the end of the last ice age. Rapid warming, followed by cooling, followed by warming, again created instability on a scale rarely experienced since. Human systems adapted unevenly. Those adaptations are visible in what followed: smaller populations, simpler tools, localized traditions. Only later does complexity re-emerge, often in different forms. What appears as sudden invention may be reinvention. What appears as origin may be recovery. The absence of records between these phases obscures the connection. Timelines record what survives. They do not record what was erased. When erosion removes layers, only endpoints remain. The result is a history marked by starts without clear beginnings and endings without clear causes. Civilization appears, disappears, and returns altered. The silence between those appearances is not accidental. It reflects the fragility of continuity under environmental pressure. It reflects the limits of memory when landscapes change. These gaps do not require speculation to exist. They are documented absences. They remain unresolved because their evidence lies beyond reach, submerged, eroded, or forgotten. History resumes around these voids, not through them. What lies within them remains undefined, knowledge that arrived fully formed. In several moments of early history, systems of knowledge appear without visible preparation. Writing emerges already standardized. Mathematics begins with abstraction rather than counting. Astronomy opens with long cycles already measured. These systems do not resemble experiments in progress. They resemble inheritances placed into use. In Mesopotamia, the earliest known writing appears around 3200 BCE. Cuneiform tablets from Uruk do not show gradual invention. The signs are already organized. Numerical systems are already functional. Administrative records appear immediately complex, tracking labor, grain, and land with precision. There are no surviving examples of partial scripts or failed attempts. Writing enters the record as a finished tool. The numerical system used alongside early cuneiform is base 60. This choice is not intuitive. It requires abstraction beyond simple counting. Base 60 allows division by many numbers and supports fractions with ease. The system persists today in the measurement of time and angles. Its origin is not explained in the record. It is simply present. Astronomy develops alongside writing with similar completeness. Early Mesopotamian texts record planetary movements, eclipse cycles, and lunar periods with consistency. The Saros cycle, which predicts eclipses over an 18-year period, was known long before telescopes. This knowledge requires sustained observation across generations. It cannot be derived from a short period of study. In Egypt, geometry appears with administrative purpose. Land surveying required accurate measurement after annual Nile floods. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, dated to around 1650 BCE, but copied from older sources, shows knowledge of fractions, area calculation, and linear equations. The text presents these methods as established practice, not innovation. The precision embedded in Egyptian architecture reinforces this observation. Alignments to cardinal directions are accurate within fractions of a degree. Such alignment requires astronomical reference and standardized measurement. These practices appear early and remain consistent. They do not evolve noticeably through trial and error. Calendar systems present a similar pattern. Many ancient cultures track time using cycles that align with astronomical realities. Solar years, lunar months, and intercalary adjustments were integrated into ritual and agriculture. These systems require long-term observation and correction, yet they appear already balanced when first recorded. In Mesoamerica, the Maya calendar system demonstrates advanced astronomical understanding. The long count calendar tracks time across vast spans with accuracy. Venus cycles were recorded with precision. Eclipses were predicted. These calculations appear in early inscriptions without evidence of gradual development. The system does not begin simply. It begins complete. Writing systems in Mesoamerica also appear abruptly. Early glyphs already represent phonetic and symbolic elements combined. There is no preserved stage where symbols lack meaning or structure. The system is complex from its first appearance. China presents a comparable case. Oracle bone inscriptions from the Shang dynasty show a fully developed writing system. The characters already correspond to spoken language. The script includes abstract concepts, grammar, and standardized forms. Earlier experimental stages are not preserved. Metallurgy follows the same pattern. Bronze production requires precise ratios, temperature control, and mold design. Early bronze artifacts appear with consistent quality. Trial pieces are rare. Failed attempts are not commonly found. The craft enters the record already regulated. This pattern repeats across disciplines. Medicine, law, and administration emerge with defined frameworks. Early legal codes outline detailed procedures and penalties. Medical texts classify conditions and treatments systematically. These are not lists of remedies gathered randomly. They reflect organized knowledge. One explanation is that earlier stages existed but did not survive. This is possible, yet it raises questions. Early experimentation would produce debris, variation, and localized differences. Claspination and localized differences. What appears instead is uniformity across wide regions. This suggests standardization prior to recorded history. Standardization requires authority and continuity. Measurements must be taught, symbols must be agreed upon. Observations must be preserved. These conditions imply stable institutions over time. Environmental disruption challenges such stability. When conditions change rapidly, institutions fail. Knowledge fragments. Survivors retain pieces rather than systems. When rebuilding begins, inherited frameworks may be adopted without full understanding of their origin. Texts often acknowledge this inheritance indirectly. Many ancient works claim to copy earlier sources. Egyptian scribes wrote that wisdom came from the ancestors. Mesopotamian scholars attributed knowledge to antediluvian sages. In India, knowledge is described as remembered rather than invented. These claims are often interpreted symbolically, yet their consistency across cultures suggests a shared perception. Knowledge is framed as recovery, not creation. Loss of context explains the absence of developmental stages. If experimentation occurred before major disruption, its evidence would lie in regions most affected by flooding or erosion. Coastal settlements would vanish. Perishable materials would decay. Only final results, preserved inland or in durable form, would remain. Writing, once established, becomes conservative. Scripts resist change. Mathematical systems persist even when their origins are forgotten. Astronomical cycles continue to be used long after their initial observation periods. Later cultures apply these systems pragmatically. They do not question their foundations. They use what works. Over time, explanation gives way to tradition. This creates the illusion of sudden appearance. In reality, it may represent reappearance. Knowledge resurfaces when conditions allow, carried forward by limited transmission. The sophistication of early systems challenges assumptions about linear progress. It suggests that human capability does not strictly increase over time. It fluctuates with circumstance. When conditions support observation, specialization, and record keeping, knowledge accumulates. When those conditions fail, knowledge contracts. What remains is not primitive, but partial. The reuse of inherited knowledge can mask its age. A calendar copied centuries later appears new to the copier. A mathematical method taught without history seems invented by its user. Ancient authors rarely describe origins. They describe application. This absence is often mistaken for simplicity. It may instead indicate lost depth. The persistence of certain systems across civilizations hints at deep roots. Base 60, cardinal alignment, geometric proportion, and astronomical cycles recur independently. These recurrences may reflect shared inheritance rather than coincidence. This does not require a single global culture. It requires parallel survival of fragments from earlier complexity. Similar solutions emerge when similar knowledge persists. The idea of pre-flood civilizations becomes relevant here not as a single lost empire, but as a period of stability long enough to support cumulative knowledge. When that stability ended, its products scattered unevenly. What enters recorded history may represent the surface layer of much older systems. The foundation lies beyond reach. Knowledge that appears fully formed does not demand speculation about impossible tools. It demands consideration of missing time. Systems mature quietly. Their maturation leaves little trace once erased. What remains visible are beginnings without roots. Sophistication without preparation. Memory without origin. These patterns do not resolve into certainty. They outline absence. They point toward earlier continuity that no longer survives intact. Human history retains what endures: stone, symbols, cycles. What fades is process. Knowledge arrives already shaped because shaping occurred elsewhere, earlier, and under conditions no longer present. Cities beneath the water. For most of human history, the sea did not rest where it does today. During the last ice age, vast quantities of water were locked in continental ice sheets. Sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than modern shorelines. Coastlines extended far outward. Plains existed where oceans now lie. Rivers cut across land that has since disappeared. These coastal regions would have been among the most desirable places for early settlement. Access to fresh water, marine food sources, and natural transportation routes made them ideal for sustained habitation. Over time, communities would grow outward along these margins. When the climate changed, these landscapes vanished. Between roughly 14,000 and 7,000 BCE, global sea levels rose rapidly. Meltwater pulses occurred in surges rather than gradually. In some periods, the sea rose several meters within a single human lifetime. Low-lying settlements would not have been abandoned slowly. They would have been overwhelmed. Archaeology struggles to account for what lies beneath the water. Traditional excavation focuses on dry land. What sank was removed from view before systematic record-keeping began. The absence of evidence on land does not imply absence of occupation. It reflects inaccessibility. One of the largest submerged regions is the continental shelf, now known as Doggerland. This area once connected Britain to mainland Europe. It supported rivers, forests, and human populations for thousands of years. Stone tools and animal remains dredged from the North Sea confirm long-term habitation. As sea levels rose, Doggerland fragmented into islands, then disappeared entirely. The loss of Doggerland occurred gradually, but decisively. By around 6000 BCE, most of it was submerged. Any settlements built there would now lie beneath layers of sediment. Only scattered artifacts remain, recovered accidentally through fishing and dredging. Similar drowned landscapes exist across the world. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf once connected mainland Asia to Indonesia. During lower sea levels, this region formed a continuous landmass supporting human migration and settlement. When the seas rose, the shelf flooded, isolating islands and erasing coastal sites. In the Mediterranean, underwater surveys have identified submerged structures off the coasts of Greece, Israel, and Italy. Stone walls, wells, and building foundations have been found beneath shallow waters. These sites often date to the early Neolithic or earlier. They suggest organized settlement before inundation. Off the coast of Israel, the submerged village of Atlit Yam lies beneath several meters of water. It contains stone houses, hearths, wells, and a ceremonial arrangement of large stones. Radiocarbon dating places it around 7000 BCE. The site was abandoned as sea levels rose. It was not destroyed by violence. It was overtaken by water. In the Gulf of Cambay off the western coast of India, sonar surveys revealed geometric features beneath thick sediment layers. Some recovered materials were dated to around 9500 BCE. The findings remain controversial due to the difficulty of excavation, but the scale of the structures suggests planned construction rather than random formation. Along the coast of Japan, submerged stone formations have been documented at depths consistent with post-Ice Age sea level rise. Whether natural or modified, their placement corresponds to former shorelines. If human activity occurred there, it would now be inaccessible without specialized equipment. Underwater archaeology progresses slowly. Visibility is limited. Sediment accumulates quickly. Organic materials decay. Only stone survives reliably. Even then, distinguishing human-made structures from natural formations requires careful analysis. This limitation shapes historical interpretation. What cannot be seen is often excluded from models of early development. Civilizations appear to originate inland because inland sites remain visible. Coastal complexity disappears from timelines. The result is a distorted picture. Early humans appear as small scattered groups until suddenly developing agriculture and urban centers inland. Yet coastal societies may have reached comparable levels of organization earlier, only to be erased by rising seas. Maritime knowledge likely preceded large-scale agriculture. Navigation, fishing, and coastal trade require coordination and planning. These skills would develop naturally in shoreline environments. When those environments vanished, so did the evidence of that development. Oral traditions preserve echoes of this loss. Flood stories appear worldwide. They often describe the sea advancing, land sinking, or water covering settlements. These accounts rarely focus on survival techniques. They focus on displacement. In many traditions, survivors retreat inland or to higher ground. They rebuild with limited resources. The old world is remembered as lost rather than destroyed. This framing aligns with gradual inundation rather than sudden cataclysm. Submerged cities would not leave dramatic ruins like inland stone monuments. Wood, mud brick, and early stonework would erode or be buried. What remains would be fragmented, scattered, and difficult to recognize. This helps explain why later inland civilizations appear to rise without apparent precursors. Their precursors existed elsewhere and were removed from view. The inheritance model applies here as well. Survivors carry skills and memory inland. They adapt to new environments. Some knowledge persists, other knowledge fades due to lack of relevance. Agriculture, for example, may have developed in coastal floodplains before being adapted to river valleys. When coastlines submerged, farming techniques would need modification. This adaptation would appear as invention rather than transfer. Monumental construction inland may reflect attempts to stabilize memory. Stone structures placed above flood levels endure. They become anchors in a changing landscape. Their builders may not have been the first to use such methods, but they recognized their permanence. The sea acts as a filter. It removes evidence unevenly. Regions once central become invisible. Marginal inland areas become primary sources for reconstruction. This inversion reshapes historical narrative. Modern technology is beginning to correct this imbalance. Sonar mapping, underwater drones, and sediment analysis reveal submerged features with increasing clarity. Each discovery expands the known footprint of early settlement, yet these efforts remain limited. Vast portions of the continental shelves remain unexplored. Many sites lie beyond reachable depths or beneath heavy sediment. Time, cost, and technical constraints slow progress. What is already clear is that human presence along coastlines was extensive and long-lived. The disappearance of these regions represents one of the largest losses of cultural evidence in human history. When considering pre-flood civilizations, the sea becomes central. It does not merely destroy, it conceals. It removes continuity from sight while leaving inland remnants that appear isolated. This concealment explains why certain capabilities seem to appear suddenly inland. They were not sudden, they were displaced. The notion of lost coastal cities does not rely on speculation. It rests on sea level data, geological surveys, and confirmed underwater sites. What remains uncertain is scale. How large these populations were, how complex their societies became. Even modest complexity, sustained over thousands of years, would leave cultural momentum. When disrupted, that momentum would fracture but not vanish entirely. Later, civilizations would inherit fragments without context. Practices would be repeated without explanation. Monuments would be built where safety from flooding seemed assured. The sea would become a boundary between remembered and forgotten worlds. Cities beneath the water do not announce themselves. They do not stand upright. They lie broken, buried, and silent. Their absence on land does not reflect absence in history. What survives on shore represents what escaped inundation, not what defined the age. Human history is written on surfaces that remain dry. Beneath the water lies another record, incomplete but essential. As coastlines stabilized in the mid-Holocene, new patterns emerged. Inland rivers became focal points. Civilizations flourished where land remained predictable. Memory of the drowned landscapes faded into story. Yet the sea did not erase everything. It preserved outlines, foundations, and traces awaiting rediscovery. The earliest chapters of civilization may rest offshore, beyond the reach of traditional archaeology. What is known today represents continuation after loss, not absolute beginning. The water rose, people moved, history resumed inland. What remained beneath the waves waits without witness, survivors, and the restart of the world. After large environmental disruptions, History does not end. It narrows. Populations contract. Networks dissolve. What remains is carried by smaller groups whose priority is continuity rather than expansion. These survivors do not preserve entire systems. They preserve fragments. Archaeology often treats post-collapse societies as beginnings. Villages appear, tools simplify, new traditions form. Yet these moments may represent restarts rather than origins. What follows catastrophe is not invention from nothing, but reassembly from what endures. When coastlines submerged and climate shifted, populations moved inland or toward higher ground. These movements were not organized migrations. They were responses to pressure. Groups separated. Communication weakened. Shared standards fractured. Knowledge that required coordination faded first. Certain skills survive disruption more readily than others. Practical knowledge tied to daily survival persists. Abstract systems requiring institutions, long observation, or large collaboration do not. Astronomy contracts. Writing disappears. Engineering simplifies. What remains is memory without framework. Oral tradition becomes the primary vessel. Stories condense complex events into symbolic form. Time compresses. Places blur. Causes simplify. Floods, darkness, and fire become shorthand for extended disruption. These stories are not technical records. They are mnemonic anchors. In many cultures, early post-disruption societies describe themselves as living after a separation. The language varies, but the structure repeats. There was a time before, there was a division. The present exists after loss. The details of the earlier time are vague, but its completeness is emphasized. This emphasis matters. The earlier age is rarely described as chaotic or primitive. It is described as ordered, stable, and knowledgeable. The present age is described as diminished by comparison. This inversion appears across regions without direct contact. The role of survivors is often symbolic rather than practical. A small number of individuals carry forward law, craft, or ritual. They become teachers, founders, or ancestors. Their authority derives from memory rather than innovation. In some traditions, survivors are portrayed as instructed by higher beings. In others, they are described as remembering what was forgotten. Both frames point to the same function. Knowledge is not created anew. It is reintroduced. Archaeology supports this pattern unevenly. After periods of disruption, toolkits often show continuity mixed with loss. Certain techniques persist. Others vanish abruptly. There is no smooth decline. There is selective survival. This selectivity explains why early post-collapse societies can appear sophisticated in one domain and simple in another. Agricultural knowledge may persist while architectural complexity declines. Calendrical awareness may survive while writing disappears. The restart process favors portability. Knowledge that can be carried mentally or practiced with minimal infrastructure survives. Knowledge tied to fixed locations or large installations does not. This biases what later civilizations inherit. Measurement systems offer an example. Units of length, weight, and time often persist across cultural breaks. Their origins are forgotten, but their use continues. Over time, they acquire symbolic meaning. Mythologized ancestors often serve as placeholders for lost institutions. Lawgivers, culture heroes, and civilizing figures appear suddenly in tradition. They arrive fully informed. They teach, then they depart. These figures do not behave like inventors. They do not test or refine. They deliver finished systems. This mirrors the pattern seen in early writing, mathematics, and astronomy. The social function of such figures is stabilization. After disruption, societies require coherence. Attributing systems to ancestral authority discourages alteration. Tradition becomes preservation. This dynamic explains conservatism in early civilizations. Change is slow. Innovation is cautious. The memory of loss shapes behavior. Stability is valued over experimentation. Settlement patterns reflect this caution. Early post-disruption communities often choose defensible or predictable environments. River valleys become focal points. Seasonal flooding is preferable to unpredictable coastlines. The landscape becomes a partner rather than a threat. Monument building in such contexts takes on new meaning. Stone structures anchor memory. They resist change. They signal permanence in a world that has recently proven unstable. Their placement is deliberate. Survivors may not understand the full capabilities of earlier builders, but they recognize durability. They replicate what lasts. Smaller monuments echo larger ones. Form survives without function. This echoing produces continuity without comprehension. Over generations, the echo becomes tradition. The original reference fades. Language shifts contribute to this process. Technical vocabulary disappears first. General terms remain. As words lose specificity, explanation gives way to symbolism. Precision becomes ritual. The restart of civilization is therefore not clean, it is layered. Fragments of older systems are embedded within newer cultural forms. Over time, these fragments become indistinguishable from local invention. Later historians mistake this layering for linear development. They identify the visible layer and assume it represents the whole. What lies beneath is inaccessible or invisible. The scale of loss matters. A localized disaster erases communities. A global environmental shift erases systems. When disruption occurs across continents, parallel restarts emerge. Each inherits fragments differently. This produces the illusion of independent invention. Similar systems appear in different regions. Writing, calendars, monumental architecture emerge separately. Yet their shared characteristics suggest shared inheritance rather than coincidence. The absence of direct transmission routes complicates interpretation. Trade networks collapse. Navigation becomes dangerous. Isolation increases. Knowledge spreads unevenly. What persists spreads slowly through migration and contact over centuries. By the time systems align, their common origin is no longer visible. The restart process also reshapes identity. New societies define themselves against what was lost. They emphasize beginnings. Founding myths replace continuity. Origins become sacred. This framing is adaptive. It provides meaning in the aftermath of disruption. It encourages cohesion. It discourages longing for what cannot return. Over time, the memory of loss becomes abstract. Floods become myths. Earlier ages become legendary. The practical lessons embedded in those memories fade. Yet traces remain: anomalous structures, sudden sophistication, systems that appear without preparation. These traces are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of interruption. Survivors do not rebuild the past. They rebuild forward. They adapt what they can carry. They discard what no longer fits. Civilization resumes not from zero, but from fragments. The shape of what follows reflects what endured, not what existed. This perspective reframes early history. It is not a straight ascent from simplicity to complexity. It is a series of recoveries punctuated by loss. The restart of the world does not announce itself. It unfolds quietly in villages, fields, and rituals. Its success is measured by survival, not innovation. What comes later builds upon this narrowed foundation. Over centuries, complexity returns. Writing reappears. Architecture expands. trade networks reform. By then, the original disruption lies beyond memory. What remains is a civilization that believes itself original. The survivors are no longer remembered as survivors. They become ancestors. What they carried forward defines the next age. What they lost defines its limits. Echoes in myth and memory. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, stories persist that describe an earlier age ending in loss. These accounts are not presented as distant fantasy. They are often positioned at the beginning of history itself. What follows them is the world as it is known. What precedes them is a world described as fuller, more ordered, and then removed. Flood narratives appear with unusual consistency. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh recounts a deluge sent to erase humanity. Utnapishtim survives by preserving knowledge, tools, and living creatures. The story emphasizes instruction and continuity rather than heroism. Survival is technical, not dramatic. The biblical account of Noah follows a similar structure. The flood is total. The survivors are few. What matters is preservation rather than triumph. Measurements are specified. Cycles of time are recorded. The world restarts under constraint. In India, flood stories center on Manu, warned in advance and instructed to preserve seeds, law, and ritual knowledge. The emphasis is not on punishment, but on transition. One age ends, another begins. Memory bridges the gap. In China, the Great Flood occupies a central place in early tradition. The story of Yu the Great focuses not on survival from a single vessel, but on years of water management and resettlement. The flood is prolonged. The recovery is slow. Civilization resumes through regulation rather than conquest. Mesoamerican traditions describe earlier worlds destroyed by water, darkness, or imbalance. The Popol Vuh outlines multiple creations and destructions. Each version of humanity fails or is removed. The current world is not the first attempt. It is the latest. Australian Aboriginal traditions include stories of rising seas separating land bridges and drowning coastal plains. These accounts were passed orally for thousands of years. Geological evidence confirms that such flooding occurred at the end of the last ice age. What distinguishes these stories is tone. They are not chaotic. They are procedural. They describe sequence rather than spectacle. The loss is accepted as fact, not debated. Myths of golden ages follow similar patterns. Hesiod described an earlier age of humanity that lived without labor or conflict. Later ages decline in quality and lifespan. The pattern is not progress, but reduction. In Mesoamerican thought, earlier ages are associated with greater harmony between humans and the natural world. The present age is fragile by comparison. Memory frames the past as complete, not primitive. These myths do not preserve technical detail, they preserve structure. An ordered world exists, a boundary event occurs. Survivors carry fragments forward. The new world is narrower. This structure aligns with what is observed archaeologically. Complexity appears, disappears, then returns differently. Myths compress this process into symbolic narrative. Duration collapses. Causes simplify. Memory adapts to survival needs. Technical explanations fade first. Moral or cosmological explanations endure. Floods become judgments. Environmental change becomes divine will. This transformation does not negate historical value. It reflects cognitive compression. Oral cultures prioritize meaning over measurement. Events too large to explain are reframed to remain memorable. Time depth becomes elastic. A flood that unfolds over centuries becomes a single event. Sea level rise becomes a sudden wave. Gradual loss becomes instant removal. Yet the global distribution of these stories suggests shared experience rather than coincidence. Floods are not localized in myth, they are universal. The same is true for stories of lost lands, sunken cities, and vanished peoples. Plato's account of Atlantis describes a powerful maritime society destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night. The emphasis is not on technology, but on disappearance. The sea becomes impassable. Memory ends. In Celtic tradition, lands such as Lyonesse are said to have sunk beneath the sea, leaving only fragments behind. Similar legends exist in Southeast Asia, Japan, and the Pacific. These stories often include survivors retreating to higher ground. Knowledge is reduced. The old world is inaccessible. The new world begins inland. Myth preserves directionality. Loss comes from water. Survival comes from elevation. This mirrors post-Ice Age reality, where higher ground remained habitable while coastlines vanished. Ancestral figures often appear immediately after these losses. They bring law, agriculture, or craft. They do not invent through trial. They restore order. Their authority derives from memory rather than discovery. In Egypt, Thoth is credited with bringing writing, measurement, and timekeeping. He does not develop them, he delivers them. Similar figures appear in Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and East Asia. These figures are often associated with liminal periods, appearing after catastrophe and departing once systems are established. They are not rulers, they are transmitters. Such narratives encode inheritance without lineage. Knowledge survives, but its origin is obscured. Attribution shifts from human institutions to divine intermediaries. This shift stabilizes societies emerging from disruption. Systems are preserved by sanctifying them. Questioning origins becomes taboo. Tradition solidifies. Over generations, myth hardens. Symbol replaces reference. The flood becomes moral rather than environmental. The Golden Age becomes spiritual rather than material. Yet traces of original meaning persist. Floods remain associated with water, lost lands remain coastal, survivors remain few, knowledge remains inherited. Comparative mythology reveals these shared structures clearly. Independent cultures encode similar sequences because they encode similar experiences. Environmental disruption was global. Cultural response followed similar patterns. Myth also preserves emotional orientation, fear of water, respect for stone, reverence for ancestors, preference for elevated, stable landscapes. These orientations influence settlement and architecture long after memory fades. Monumental building inland may reflect this inherited caution. Stone placed above flood levels becomes symbolic protection. Permanence becomes sacred. The use of mountains, high plateaus, and river headwaters as ritual centers aligns with this pattern. These locations represent safety and continuity. Myth does not preserve chronology accurately. It preserves consequence. The consequence of flooding is loss of continuity. The consequence of survival is inheritance under constraint. When myths are stripped of literal interpretation and examined structurally, they align with archaeological and geological patterns. They do not explain events, they remember outcomes. The consistency of these outcomes across cultures suggests a shared boundary in human experience, a time when landscapes changed faster than societies could adapt. This boundary marks the transition between what is now called prehistory and history. Writing emerges after it. Monumental cultures arise after it. Memory resets around it. What came before becomes mythic because it cannot be accessed directly. Evidence lies underwater, eroded or lost. Language no longer fits. Myth fills the gap left by missing records. It does not replace history. It bridges absence. The presence of flood and loss narratives does not require literal global inundation at once. It requires widespread, long-term environmental change experienced locally and remembered collectively. As sea levels rose and climate shifted, Each region experienced its own version of loss. These experiences converged into shared narrative forms. The persistence of these forms across thousands of years indicates their foundational role. They are not marginal stories, they are origin points. Later, religions, philosophies, and cosmologies inherit these narratives and reinterpret them. Yet the underlying structure remains intact. Human memory, like stone, preserves shape more than detail. When detail erodes, outline remains. Myth outlines a world before, a break, and a narrower world after. Archaeology reveals the same pattern in material form. The convergence of myth and evidence does not resolve uncertainty. It clarifies direction. Loss precedes continuity. Inheritance follows disruption. The echoes in myth are not noise. They are compressed records of transition. They persist because the transition mattered. Egypt and the problem of sudden greatness. Along the Nile Valley, civilization appears with unusual speed. Villages become cities. Symbols become writing. Stone becomes monument. Within a short span of time, Egypt presents architecture, administration, and cosmology already aligned into a coherent system. The question is not whether Egypt was innovative. The question is why so much appears already complete. Predynastic Egypt shows gradual development in pottery styles, burial practices, and social hierarchy. Small communities form along the riverbanks. Trade networks expand slowly. Yet around 3100 BCE, this gradual pattern shifts. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt introduces centralized authority, standardized symbols, and state-level organization almost at once. Writing appears fully structured. Hieroglyphs are not tentative marks. They are already symbolic, phonetic, and grammatical. Hundreds of signs exist from the earliest inscriptions. Administrative documents record taxes, labor, and property. There is no visible phase where writing is experimental or unstable. The same is true of measurement. Egyptian units of length, volume, and weight appear standardized from the start. The cubit, subdivided with precision, is used consistently across monuments. Surveying techniques allow land to be reassigned accurately after annual floods. This requires mathematical understanding and institutional continuity. Architecture reinforces the pattern. Early dynastic tombs evolve rapidly into large stone structures. Mastabas grow in scale and complexity. Then, during the 4th dynasty, pyramid construction reaches a level that is never surpassed. The Great Pyramid at Giza emerges without a clear developmental trail leading to it. Earlier pyramids exist, but they do not explain the leap. The Step Pyramid of Djoser shows experimentation in form, yet its construction methods differ significantly from those used at Giza. The transition from stepped layers to smooth-sided precision occurs quickly. The techniques do not appear to evolve gradually. The Great Pyramid demonstrates accurate alignment to true north within a fraction of a degree. The base is level within centimeters across hundreds of meters. The internal chambers are placed with precision. Granite blocks are transported and fitted with minimal tolerance. These features require planning, coordination, and expertise. Egyptian records celebrate the king and the divine order. They do not describe engineering processes. Inscriptions honor builders, but do not explain methods. Later, Egyptians repaired pyramids and temples without recording how the originals were constructed. Knowledge appears assumed rather than documented. This absence is not accidental. Egyptian culture valued continuity. What was inherited was preserved, not analyzed. Systems were maintained through ritual and repetition. Questioning origins was unnecessary. Egyptian cosmology reflects this orientation. Time is cyclical. Creation is renewal rather than invention. the world is restored daily through ritual. The past is not distant, it is present and authoritative. Kingship itself is framed as inheritance. The pharaoh does not create order. He maintains ma'at, the balance established at the beginning. Disorder is temporary. Stability is the default state. This worldview aligns with the idea of resumption after loss. If an earlier order existed and was disrupted, later society would frame its role as restoration. Innovation would be secondary to preservation. Egyptian myth supports this framing. The reign of Osiris is described as a time of harmony before disruption. After his death, order must be re-established. The cycle repeats, loss precedes renewal. The gods associated with knowledge are portrayed as bringers rather than creators. Thoth introduces writing, measurement, and timekeeping. He does not experiment, he delivers established systems. His role is transmission. These narratives do not claim invention. They claim recovery. Knowledge arrives from beyond the immediate present. Archaeology does not contradict this view. Certain construction techniques appear briefly and then vanish. Core masonry styles used in early monumental buildings are not repeated in later periods with the same quality. Stone joints widen, precision relaxes, scale diminishes. This does not reflect decline in intelligence or effort. It reflects loss of method. Once a technique dependent on long training and coordination is interrupted, it does not easily return. Environmental stability along the Nile may have allowed Egypt to preserve inherited systems longer than other regions. Annual flooding was predictable. Agricultural surplus was reliable. Institutions could persist. Egypt's geography insulated it from some disruptions. Deserts limited invasion. The river concentrated resources. This stability allowed preservation of what had already been received. The question remains of origin. Where did the knowledge come from before dynastic Egypt? Inland Egypt shows limited evidence of long-term development leading to Giza-level construction. Coastal and delta regions, now deeply buried or altered, may have held earlier phases. The Nile Delta has shifted repeatedly over millennia. Sediment accumulation obscures early settlements. Rising sea levels altered coastlines. What lies beneath the delta remains largely unexplored. If earlier societies occupied coastal or deltaic zones during lower sea levels, their disappearance would leave little trace. Survivors moving upriver would carry skills and memory without infrastructure. This movement aligns with Egypt's orientation. The earliest monumental focus appears slightly inland, above flood-prone areas. Stone construction favors elevated plateaus. Permanence is prioritized. The pyramids themselves sit above the floodplain. They are placed where water cannot reach. Their form suggests concern with endurance rather than habitation. Egyptian emphasis on afterlife also reflects continuity across loss. Tombs preserve identity beyond disruption. Stone protects memory against time and water. The sudden greatness of Egypt does not require an external civilization imposing itself. It requires inheritance from a prior phase of human organization that no longer exists in visible form. Egypt becomes a repository rather than an origin point. It gathers fragments, preserves them, and integrates them into a stable system. This perspective explains why Egypt appears both innovative and conservative. It adapts inherited forms but resists alteration. It refines symbolism while preserving structure. The long duration of Egyptian civilization supports this role. While other cultures rise and fall, Egypt maintains core patterns for millennia. Such persistence suggests early stabilization around received systems. The loss of earlier contexts transforms inheritance into mystery. Later, observers see sudden emergence because they cannot see what was removed. The pyramids do not announce their origins. They stand complete. Their builders left no manuals. Their methods were not transmitted openly. They became sacred. Sacred things are preserved without explanation. Their authority lies in age, not understanding. Egypt's greatness appears sudden because it is visible where earlier phases are hidden. Its monuments rise where the flood did not reach. What preceded dynastic Egypt may have been broader and more dispersed. What followed was concentrated and durable. Egypt does not break the pattern observed elsewhere, it exemplifies it: early completeness, later maintenance. Eventual simplification. The problem of sudden greatness dissolves when continuity is reframed. Egypt did not invent from nothing, it resumed from fragments. What remains visible today is not the beginning of civilization, but a preserved segment after loss. The Nile carried memory forward. Stone held it in place. What was lost? What endured? When large portions of the early world disappeared, loss did not occur evenly. Some forms of knowledge vanished almost completely. Others survived in reduced form. The shape of later civilization reflects this imbalance. What endured did so because it could persist without large system. What was lost required scale, continuity, or environment that no longer existed. Complex infrastructure was among the first casualties. Ports, canals, coastal cities, and navigation hubs depended on stable shorelines. As seas rose and coastlines shifted, these systems became unusable. Stone harbors flooded, trade routes dissolved. Without access to the sea, maritime coordination ended. Knowledge tied to these networks faded rapidly. Large-scale engineering suffered similar loss. Projects requiring generations of planning could not survive disruption. Quarrying networks broke down. Transport routes disappeared. Skilled labor scattered. Once interrupted, precision stonework became difficult to sustain. What remained were completed structures, not the systems that produced them. Writing did not survive everywhere. Scripts tied to administration required institutions to maintain them. When centralized authority collapsed, literacy declined. Oral tradition replaced record keeping. Written systems later re-emerged, but often with different structures and symbols. Continuity was broken. Advanced scientific observation also contracted. Astronomy requires long-term measurement across generations. When populations dispersed, observational records were lost. Cycles already discovered survived in simplified form, but the process of discovery did not. Calendars remained. Methods faded. What endured most reliably was what could be memorized. Counting systems, basic geometry, seasonal knowledge, and ritual practices survived because they could be taught orally. These forms of knowledge adapt easily to new environments. They do not require permanent installations. Symbolic systems endured better than technical ones. Myths, cosmologies, and moral frameworks carried memory of loss and continuity. These systems helped stabilize societies after disruption. They framed survival as order restored rather than chaos escaped. Measurement systems persisted in simplified form. Units of time, distance, and weight continued to be used even when their origins were forgotten. Precision relaxed, but structure remained. This allowed later civilizations to rebuild complexity without starting from nothing. Agricultural knowledge survived unevenly. Techniques tied to specific environments were lost when those environments disappeared. Broader principles persisted. Seed saving, seasonal planting, and irrigation adapted to new landscapes. Crops changed. Practice continued. Language preserved fragments of earlier worlds. Words for tools, materials, and concepts remained even when their original reference vanished. These linguistic remnants embedded memory into daily speech without explanation. Monumental stone endured because of material choice. Stone resists water, fire, and time. Structures placed above flood levels survived where wood and earth vanished. This durability created an illusion of emphasis. What survived appears intentional. What vanished becomes invisible. Later, civilizations built around what endured. Stone became sacred. Cycles became divine. Ancestral authority replaced technical explanation. This shift favored preservation over experimentation. Selective survival shaped values. Stability became prized. Innovation slowed. Societies favored repetition over risk. Memory of loss discouraged expansion into unstable environments. What disappeared entirely left no echo. Technologies that relied on organic materials, coastal access, or complex coordination left little trace. Without artifacts, they remain unknown. Their absence cannot be measured directly. This asymmetry distorts history. What endures defines narrative. What vanished is excluded. Civilizations appear to originate where preservation was possible, not where development was greatest. Inland river valleys dominate historical accounts because they remained accessible. Coastal plains, likely dense with early activity, vanished beneath water. The surviving record is partial by nature. Inheritance thus becomes selective. Later cultures inherit what survives physically or mentally. They do not choose what is lost. Their achievements are shaped by constraint rather than preference. The endurance of certain systems across civilizations reflects resilience rather than superiority. Base numerical systems, calendar cycles, and geometric ratios survive because they are portable and adaptable. The loss of others reflects vulnerability. Precision engineering, long-distance navigation, and institutional science require stability. When stability breaks, these systems fail first. This pattern does not imply decline as a permanent condition. It implies reset. Over time, stability returns. Complexity rebuilds. New systems emerge, sometimes resembling what was lost, sometimes diverging. What is rebuilt often incorporates surviving fragments. Old cycles inform new calendars, old symbols inform new writing, old forms inspire new monuments. Yet rebuilding is not restoration. Context is different. Environment has changed. Resources differ. The new world is narrower. This narrowing influences trajectory. Civilizations grow inland rather than coastal. Stone replaces wood. Ritual replaces explanation. Authority replaces experiment. Over millennia, the memory of loss fades. Survivors become ancestors. Fragments become foundations. What was once incomplete becomes normalized. History records this normalization as progress. Yet beneath it lies selective survival shaped by catastrophe. Understanding what was lost is difficult because evidence is absent. Understanding what endured is easier because it remains visible. This imbalance must be acknowledged. The endurance of early knowledge does not prove uninterrupted advancement. It proves resilience under constraint. What vanished defines the limits of later civilization as much as what survived defines its strengths. Human history is therefore not a straight ascent. It is shaped by subtraction. Each disruption removes possibilities. Each restart selects from what remains. What endures becomes tradition. What is lost becomes silence. Later, civilizations mistake endurance for origin. They assume what remains was always central. In reality, it is what escaped erasure. Stone, symbol, and cycle endured because they could. Other forms did not. This uneven inheritance shaped the ancient world and continues to shape how that world is understood today. The inheritance misunderstood. When later civilizations encountered the remnants of earlier worlds, they did not meet them as historians or engineers. They met them as inheritors without context. Stone structures stood where builders were gone. Systems operated without recorded origin. Meaning replaced method. Inherited architecture was among the most visible remnants. Large stone platforms, foundations, and chambers remained usable long after their original purpose faded. Later cultures occupied these spaces, repaired them, and adapted them to new uses. Over time, the function shifted from practical to symbolic. A stone structure that could not be reproduced gained authority through age alone. Its endurance suggested intention beyond human scale. Builders were reimagined as gods, giants, or ancestral beings. This reframing protected the structure from alteration. Sacred objects are preserved more carefully than understood ones. Ritual replaced explanation. Movements through inherited spaces became ceremonies. Measurements became sacred proportions. Orientation became cosmology. What began as practical alignment turned into divine order. This transformation stabilized societies emerging after disruption. By sacralizing inherited systems, change slowed. Innovation was constrained by reverence. The unknown past became untouchable. Writing systems illustrate this shift clearly. Scripts originally developed for accounting and administration became vehicles for ritual and authority. Once writing was restricted to priestly or elite classes, its role changed. Recording reality became secondary to preserving tradition. Texts were copied faithfully, but rarely interrogated. Errors accumulated. Context dissolved. Authority increased. A document's age became more important than its accuracy. Calendars followed a similar path. Observational astronomy contracted into ritual timekeeping. Festivals aligned with inherited cycles whose original empirical basis was no longer examined. Adjustment gave way to repetition. Mathematics shifted from tool to symbol. Ratios and proportions used in construction became markers of cosmic harmony. Geometry gained metaphysical meaning. Practical calculation merged with theology. Law also underwent reinterpretation. Codes attributed to ancestral figures or divine sources became immutable. Adaptation slowed. Stability was favored over responsiveness. This preserved order but limited flexibility. In many cultures, civilizing figures appear suddenly in tradition. They bring laws, writing, agriculture, or measurement. They do not invent through trial. They transmit complete systems. Afterward, they depart or withdraw. These figures reflect inheritance without lineage. Knowledge arrives without visible development. Attribution shifts from human institutions to mythic intermediaries. This shift resolves uncertainty. If origins are unclear, divinity provides explanation. What cannot be replicated is declared sacred. What cannot be explained is preserved through story. Archaeological layers reflect this reinterpretation. Later modifications to inherited sites prioritize symbolism over function. Additions align with cosmology rather than efficiency. Decoration increases. Structural innovation decreases. The meaning of stone changes. Weight and durability become metaphors for permanence. Height becomes closeness to the divine. Depth becomes mystery. Original engineering intent is no longer relevant. This process creates continuity without comprehension. Societies remain connected to the past through objects rather than understanding. Over time, the objects define identity. Misunderstanding does not imply failure. It implies adaptation. Societies use what they have. They assign meaning that fits their needs. Practical remnants become cultural anchors. The cost of this adaptation is loss of method. Once function is replaced by ritual, reverse engineering becomes unlikely. Questioning sacred forms is discouraged. This explains why certain techniques are never recovered. Precision stonework is admired but not replicated. Astronomical alignments are celebrated but not recalculated. Systems persist as fixed templates. Over generations, reinterpretation deepens, symbols layer upon symbols, original reference points vanish. What remains is tradition self-justifying through age. Later historians encounter these traditions and mistake reinterpretation for intention. They assume ritual meaning was always primary. Practical origins are overlooked. This misunderstanding extends into modern interpretation. Ancient achievements are evaluated only within visible cultural frameworks. Missing context is ignored because it is absent. Yet the pattern is consistent. Inherited systems become sacred. Sacred systems resist analysis. Resistance preserves form while erasing origin. The inheritance is not lost. It is transformed. Its shape survives. Its purpose does not. Civilizations built upon this transformed inheritance achieve stability and identity. They also inherit limits. Innovation is constrained by reverence. Change becomes cyclical rather than exploratory. This conservatism explains long cultural continuity in some regions. It also explains stagnation relative to potential. The misunderstanding of inheritance is not accidental. It is functional. It allows societies to move forward without resolving gaps they cannot fill. What is misunderstood becomes myth. What is mythologized becomes untouchable. What is untouchable endures. The result is a past that feels intentional but remains opaque. Structures stand. Systems operate. Explanations are symbolic. The inheritance shapes civilization without revealing itself. What was once practical becomes sacred. What was once known becomes revered. What was once understood becomes unquestioned. This transformation completes the passage from pre-flood continuity to historical tradition. The world moves on, carrying fragments reshaped by necessity. The question that remains: across the long record of human history, patterns appear that do not resolve into a single answer. They remain visible because they repeat. Civilizations emerge with advanced systems already in place. Knowledge appears without preparation. Stone structures endure without explanation. Maps preserve worlds that no longer exist. Myths remember loss without detail. Timelines contain silence. These patterns do not point to a single vanished empire or a unified forgotten culture. They point to something broader. They suggest that human history has not moved in a straight, uninterrupted line. It has narrowed, broken, and resumed more than once. The material record reflects this uneven movement. What survives is not representative of what once existed. It is representative of what escaped erasure. Stone placed above flood levels remains. Knowledge carried orally survives. Systems requiring stability vanish. What is missing shapes interpretation as much as what remains. Modern archaeology works within these limits. It reconstructs from fragments. It relies on what can be accessed, dated, and measured. Submerged landscapes remain difficult to study. Coastal histories remain incomplete. Early phases of development are often inferred rather than observed. This limitation does not invalidate current understanding. It defines its boundary. The further back inquiry reaches, the more the record thins. Certainty decreases, not because nothing existed, but because evidence does not persist evenly. The possibility of earlier advanced societies does not rest on speculation alone. It rests on convergence. Independent lines of evidence suggest discontinuity. Geology documents rapid environmental change. Archaeology reveals abrupt cultural resets. Myth preserves memory of loss. Cartography hints at older geographies. None of these lines prove a single conclusion on their own. Together, they outline a problem rather than a solution. The problem is continuity. How much of human development has been removed from view by water, time, and collapse? The word advanced requires caution. It does not imply modern technology or global dominance. It implies organization, specialization, and accumulated knowledge beyond subsistence. Such societies could exist without leaving durable traces if their environments disappeared. Coastal and riverine worlds would be especially vulnerable. When seas rise and rivers shift, settlements vanish. Knowledge disperses. Survivors adapt inland. What follows appears new, because what came before is inaccessible. Later civilizations inherit fragments of this lost continuity. They stabilize around what endures. Over generations, fragments become foundations. Inheritance becomes origin. The record then suggests sudden beginnings. Egypt rises fully formed. Writing appears standardized. Astronomy begins precise. These moments appear miraculous only because their antecedents are missing. The question that remains is not whether something was lost. Loss is evident. The question is scale. How much was lost, and how many times did loss occur? Environmental data indicates that the end of the last ice age was not a single event, but a series of disruptions. Sea level rise, cooling, warming, and flooding occurred unevenly across regions. Human responses would vary. Some societies would fragment, others would endure longer. Some knowledge would survive in one place and vanish in another. This uneven survival explains regional differences. It also explains similarity without direct contact. Shared inheritance does not require continuous connection. It requires parallel survival of fragments. The absence of direct evidence for pre-flood civilizations is expected, not suspicious. Flooding removes context more thoroughly than erosion or fire. Underwater remains are difficult to locate and interpret. Time further obscures them. As technology improves, new evidence emerges slowly. Submerged villages are identified. Ancient coastlines are mapped. Each discovery expands the known footprint of early human activity. None resolves the larger question. They deepen it. Modern assumptions about progress influence interpretation. The expectation that technology always advances leads to dismissal of early sophistication. When sophistication appears early, it is labeled anomalous. When decline follows, it is minimized. Yet decline is as natural as growth. Systems collapse under pressure. Knowledge contracts. Later recovery does not guarantee restoration. The persistence of certain ancient achievements alongside the disappearance of others suggests selectivity rather than linearity. Human capability adapts to conditions. It does not accumulate automatically. The question that remains is therefore not about lost perfection. It is about lost continuity. How many times did humanity rebuild from fragments without remembering what came before? This question resists closure because it lies at the edge of evidence. It cannot be resolved through one discovery or one text. It requires integration of geology, archaeology, anthropology, and memory. Even then, certainty may remain out of reach. The earliest chapters of human organization may never be fully reconstructed. Too much lies underwater. Too much was built of materials that do not endure. What remains are patterns, repetition without explanation, sophistication without roots, loss remembered as myth, stone without manuals. These patterns do not demand belief. They demand reconsideration of assumptions. Civilization may be older, more fragile, and more cyclical than traditionally imagined. The idea of pre-flood ghost civilizations does not replace existing history. It reframes it. It suggests that what is visible represents survival rather than origin. History begins where records survive, not where human capability begins. The world has changed repeatedly. Humans have adapted repeatedly. Each adaptation carries forward fragments shaped by loss. What is called the ancient world may already be a restarted world. The question that remains is not who built first, but how much was forgotten, and whether forgetting was the exception or the rule. If this exploration changed how you think about ancient history, consider supporting the channel by liking the video and subscribing for future long-form documentaries. New episodes continue to examine lost civilizations, forgotten timelines, and the quiet evidence left behind by the distant past. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and share this with anyone who enjoys history that looks beyond familiar explanations.